And what I was noticing was the fact that foreign bad actors, which I would include the government of China, Mexico, the Muslim Brotherhood, see immigration as a weapon. So they've weaponized it and they've created tools and techniques that are designed to exploit our system.
This is Steve Robinson, host of The Robinson Report, and I am pleased to have with us today Peter Schweizer. He's the author most recently of The Invisible Coup: How the American Elites and Foreign Powers Use Immigration as a Weapon. And I'm excited to talk with you about this book because, Peter, we've been talking now for 3 years about the nefarious influence of the Chinese Communist Party in the United States. Your last book, I guess Clinton Cash and also Blood Money, touched on this a little bit. And even on Maine, there was actually a reference within your book to a group of marijuana entrepreneurs, we should call them, who are active in the state of Maine, including an associate of Hunter Biden. And I also think that there's an element of your latest book that also applies to Maine and to Mainers, which is the idea of these facilities in the United States where women who are 6 months pregnant come over from China and give birth to U.S. citizens and then return to China. And that over a 10, 20, 30-year time frame presents all kinds of difficulties and security threats and threats actually to the nature of democracy and democratic rule and self-government here in the United States. So I guess, the first question I would have is, how long have you been wanting to write this particular book? And what kind of gave you the inspiration to tackle the topic of how immigration is being used as a weapon against the American people?
Well, Steve, it's great to be on with you on the podcast. You've done amazing work in the state of Maine on this issue of Chinese penetration and attempts to manipulate our system to their advantage. I think that's just been vital. So it's great to join you. I've always felt like the immigration debate, which we've been having now for more than a decade in the country, was missing a component. We tended to look at through the lens of traditional immigration, which is, people come here. It may have an effect on wages and jobs. It may have affection on rates of crime. But it's basically the same issue that it's always been with immigration. And what I was noticing was the fact that foreign bad actors, which I would include the government of China, Mexico, the Muslim Brotherhood, see immigration as a weapon. So they've weaponized it and they've created tools and techniques that are designed to exploit our system for their benefit and to our detriment. So that's the angle I wanted to look at. And the exploitation of birthright citizenship upon which China is acting on a industrial scale, I think is probably the biggest missed story that has been out there, because just the scale of it. We don't actually track these numbers. Our federal government does not track the number of pregnant women coming to the United States, giving birth so their child can get, U.S. citizenship and then returning back to China, where that child will be raised, even though they're still going to be U.S. citizens and they'll be able to vote when they're 18. We have no idea what the numbers are, but China has looked at this. That research firms there have looked at it, and the numbers are eye-popping. They say over the last 13 years, on average, roughly 100,000 babies a year have been born in the U.S. or on territories like Saipan and have been granted U.S. citizenship, which means we now literally have more than 1 million, quote unquote, U.S. citizens who were born here but have been raised in China under the CCP. They're going to be able to vote, donate to political campaigns, take government jobs, et cetera. So it's a massive national security breach.
Now, this actually, there's another link back to Maine that I can think of, in that in the 2024 election, the balance of power in the State House was decided by the UOCAVA votes, the Uniformed Overseas Votes. This is how members of the military who are deployed, or their spouses, or people who are U.S. citizens and are eligible to vote, are able to vote despite being based in Europe or Africa or something like that. And we actually found a case of an individual who was 8 years old when he left Windham, Maine, his family moved to Denmark, and he'd never returned to the United States. He'd never taken a job, never paid taxes, never gone to school. But because he was born in Maine, he was eligible to vote. And the Secretary of State here actually found him somehow and registered him to vote. And he was able to vote in local elections and statewide elections. And it was as easy as sending an email for him to vote. So would these Chinese nationals who were technically born in the United States be able to vote without even coming back and setting foot in the United States like this citizen of Denmark was?
It's a great question, Steve. State by state, it's determined what residency requirements exist. Most of them are very loose and very liberal. Some of them require you to have a address or a place that you can receive mail, et cetera, at least a week or 10 days before an election. And there have been cases reported where 15 or 20 foreign nationals will, simply list their address at an apartment in, Tucson, Arizona, or wherever. So it's a huge problem. And what we try to do in our country is make voting relatively easy to do. But if you're dealing in a world where you have foreign actors in China and elsewhere that can vote and manipulate the system, you can't make it too easy. And it sounds like the situation in Maine is way too easy. And it should be pointed out, by the way, Steve, in the context of China, this birth tourism industry has been encouraged by the CCP. I mean, they've run articles in the People's Daily, which is their main publication, talking about, think about this, telling the elite of China that they have a constitutional right to get U.S. citizenship for their children. Now, why is the CCP encouraging their elite to do this? And when you look at the birth tourism companies in China that are facilitating this process, the clients that are listed are military officers, intelligence officers, propagandists, CCP officials. These are not dissidents. These are members of the Chinese elite. So the scenario you laid out, the fact that you laid out in Maine, should be enormously concerning if you are in a state where it's very, very easy to establish residency, where they don't even have to come to the United States. They can vote absentee.
Well, I'll say the People's Daily isn't the only newspaper cheering on this kind of activity. We also have Maine Public, our taxpayer-funded media outlet, as well as the Lewiston Sun Journal, which is now bankrolled by George Soros. Back maybe 8 or 10 years ago, they were hailing the proposed investment from a company called Miracle Enterprises. This was a Chinese-owned company that was going to come into the Lewiston, Auburn area, buy a distressed mill property, and turn it into what was advertised as at the time as medical tourism. And the city leaders were saying that this was going to be a really good thing. It was going to bring jobs and money. And what we were going to see is very wealthy Chinese people coming to the Lewiston Auburn area and getting hip replacements or plastic surgery or open heart surgery. And this was just going to be an economic boon for the region. The deal ended up falling apart, and the investors, the owners behind that project, have now pivoted to medicinal marijuana, go figure. But it appears in hindsight from looking at the work that you've done, what this project was really about was birth tourism, not medical tourism, but building a place where Chinese officials, sponsored by the CCP, could give birth to U.S. citizens who 18 years from now could bring to fruition long-term goals of communist China. Do you think this is happening in all 50 states, or did you find it mostly in California and other blue states that are closer to mainland China?
Yeah, it tends to be the states that are closer to China, but Maine would be, I think, a great location for this kind of work. And, let's be clear, by the way, this is not only a national security threat in terms of, getting citizenship for the children of Chinese elites and on a large scale. It's also not economically beneficial. as I lay out in the book, the hospitals in California complain that the Chinese elites come here. They are put up in an apartment or at a hotel. Now, these are the elite. They've paid a Chinese company $80,000 to $100,000 to arrange all these details. One of the things they're instructed to do, Steve, is to tell the hospital that they're destitute. So in other words, I can't pay the $36,000, $40,000 that it's going to take for a normal birth in a hospital. I'm only going to be able to pay you $5,000 or $6,000. So the notion that people are going to come from China and pay full freight, and somehow it's going to create all these medical jobs. Every place that this is happening, birth tourism, it is a net loss for these hospitals. The problem is the hospitals, as they are chartered, cannot simply refuse service to these individuals who are coming and saying they're destitute because there's no proof that they're not destitute. So it's not an economic winner. And we should also add there's the additional problem of surrogacy. This is where members of the Chinese elite will contract with a woman in America. The Chinese member of the elite will donate their sperm. The American woman will carry the child to term. The birth mother might be paid $50,000, $60,000. When that child is born, again, born in the United States, birthright citizenship, has the added benefit of the biological mother is American. But again, the child is immediately taken back to China, where it's going to be raised in the CCP system by a member of the elite. And we don't know the full numbers here, but just a couple of data points. The Wall Street Journal had a front page story about 8 or 10 weeks ago about a single Chinese billionaire who's close to the CCP. I think he's in the video game business.
Yes.
He has more than 100 children born this way, 100 children. That are presumably U.S. citizens. We found that just in Southern California, there are 107 Chinese-owned surrogacy companies that are offering these services. In other words, we'll find a woman that you pay $60,000, we'll get the medical procedure done so she becomes impregnated with your sperm, and then your child will become a U.S. citizen. And of course, when your child is a citizen, when they turn 18, they can sponsor you and your spouse to come and live in the United States as permanent residents. So the chain migration begins.
This sounds an awful lot like some dystopian version of human trafficking and sex trafficking. You know, and I'm not a psychic or a mind reader. I have no ability to commune with the dead, but I don't think that when the founders of the country were writing the Constitution, that they envisioned birthright citizenship involving Chinese video game executives using, you know, a turkey baster to impregnate 100 women to have U.S. citizen children. So obviously there's a problem here, and you've done the investigative work to identify the problem here. It's a social problem, an economic problem, a national security problem. It's morally reprehensible what's happening. There's nothing good that can possibly be coming of this. There seems to be no moral argument to be made in favor of this. You know, I could understand the anchor baby argument that left-wing immigration advocates will sometimes make about an illegal alien who has entered into the United States over the Mexican border and then had a child and started a family. I can at least understand that argument.
Yeah.
But there's no argument in defense of what the CCP is doing here, whether it's the surrogacy or the systematized, birth tourism. So what is the solution here? I know the Supreme Court may soon decide on the question of birthright citizenship, but there have to be legal avenues, legislation that Congress could pursue that would put an end to this practice. And then, you know, if you stop it now, you also have the millions of U.S. citizens currently in China, going to, Beijing spy school before they return to the United States that you also have to deal with. So having looked at the problem very closely, what would you say are the solutions that Congress could work on to prevent this scheme from doing whatever it is the CCP plans to do with it?
Yeah, my hope is that the Supreme Court is going to, if not get rid of birthright citizenship completely, say that you can limit its scope, right? That in these cases we're talking about birth tourism and surrogacy. Clearly, that was not the intention, and that Congress or the executive can limit those areas. Going forward, I think we need to ban the birth tourism industry, and I think we have to recognize that what the 14th Amendment was about freeing the slaves, and it was about
Yes.
jurisdiction, people that are permanently living in the United States under our jurisdiction, children born here in that context should be granted citizenship. That doesn't apply to birth tourists. The child is here only so long as they need to be here medically and they can't fly. Once they're ready to fly, if they're a week old, they fly back to China, and that's where they raise. So I'm hoping the Supreme Court's going to decide right on that. But we should, in Congress, they should ban birth tourism. I would point out, Steve, it's really ironic that the epicenter for a lot of the surrogacy and the birth tourism is California, because California has very, very few, if any, regulations in this area whatsoever, which is kind of ironic. I mean, I can't think of one other area where California is one of the least regulated states. So usually these things are handled at the state level, but I have no confidence that California wants to change this one iota. So it's going to have to be Congress that comes in and rewrites these issues related to birth tourism and surrogacy, because California is not going to step up the plate and deal with this.
Now, you've focused quite a bit on how the CCP, the Chinese, are systematizing and exploiting birthright citizenship. What elements within the United States government, have been turning a blind eye to this, or actually actively supporting it and getting wealthy from it? Because there has to be some element, some faction within the U.S. that's benefiting from what's happening here.
Yeah, it's very interesting. On the birth tourism, it really started to take off in 2014 when Barack Obama signed an agreement with the Chinese offering 10-year travel visas, meaning if you were from China and you got a travel visa to the United States, it would last 10 years. You didn't even have to go through and apply or declare for a visa after that. And people in the industry all said, this is fantastic, because now people can just float through. And they recorded numerous examples. There was one senior Chinese military officer who had 3 children. His wife got pregnant. She'd come here and do it, get pregnant, same thing. So it became much more efficient under the Obama administration. The Obama administration also said that people, Customs and Border Patrol, could not ask women coming from China who were pregnant if they were planning to give birth in the United States. Now, Donald Trump has reversed that, which I think is good and a fair question, because with birth tourism, Steve, you have to lie on your visa. They are told when you come to the United States and you get your visa form, say you're coming as a tourist. Do not say you're coming for a medical procedure, because that becomes much more complicated and you may be denied entry. Just say you're coming to be here as a visitor on a tourist visa. So they're lying on their visa applications. So what the federal government can do to catch these people at the border is pretty limited. And it's very clear, as I point out in the book, that the Democratic Party really figured out in the 1990s that mass migration and minting new citizens is a huge political win for Democrats. They discovered that 85% of newly minted citizens tend to vote for Democrats, which is fine. They have a right to do that. That tends to even out over time, but that advantage lasts for almost 20 years. The problem is that the Democrat administrations, the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, and the Biden administration all did this. When they came into office, they immediately loosened the citizenship requirements. You're supposed to undergo a criminal background check. Well, they ignored them by the hundreds of thousands. You're supposed to show some proficiency in English. They basically watered that down and said, don't even worry about that. You're required to show some basic knowledge of American civics. Again, they dumbed that down because the goal became to ram through as many people as possible, particularly in election years. And so the biggest years that we have on record in the United States in recent years for new U.S. citizens are 1996, 2012, and 2024, which are all what? Re-election years for Democrats. So my parents were immigrants, came to this country. I believe in immigration, but it's become weaponized. It's become politicized. We cannot be dumbing down the tests for political benefit. And that's what Democrats have been doing. So I don't know how you fix that problem. You can pass laws, but we already have laws on the books that require citizenship tests to meet a certain standard, and they already ignore those. So it's a real problem if the Democrats retake the White House and what they will do with these requirements.
And again, this hits close to home here in Maine because we've been subject to forced migrant resettlement. For 25 years, it was the Somali diaspora settling primarily in Lewiston. But then again in 2019 and again in 2023, it was thousands of Central Africans from Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi that settled in southern Maine. And our Secretary of State, who is now running for governor, has gone out on a podcast with Mark Elias and said that she believes there are non-citizens registered to vote in Maine.
I'm sure there are, in some isolated instances, some non-citizens may be on the roll.
She's later denied ever having said that, but she did admit that. And at the same time, she's refusing to turn over the central voter registration file to the Department of Justice. She's also giving real IDs to non-citizens who present only work authorization documents. So this process that you describe of non-citizens entering the country and then having an influence on elections, it seems like the left, at least in Maine, is admitting that it's happening, and they've created the pathway for it to happen. So how prevalent do you think the non-citizen vote is in states like Maine, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, some of these margin purple states that are decisive in some of our presidential elections or Senate elections? How big of a factor do you think immigration, legal and illegal, is playing in electoral outcomes?
It's a great question. I think it happens on two levels. The first one is what you identified, which is the issue of voting and voting security. And when you have government officials who are inclined to see voting and the voting process and citizenship as a political advantage, they can't be trusted to monitor that. But even if you have a situation where migrants are not voting, it still has enormous political import, primarily for Democrats, because the way that our U.S. Census is calculated is we don't count citizens, we count people. And that is subject to debate, and the Trump administration has talked about maybe changing that. But the bottom line is we don't count citizens, we count people. Well, why is that relevant? It's relevant because that means you're also counting people that are illegally in the country, and it means it incentivizes states like California, for example, and potentially Maine to encourage illegal migrants to be in their state. The state of California right now, the estimates are that because of the way they do the census, California has between 4 and 7 more congressional seats than it would ordinarily have if you were just counting citizens. So that means they have more political power. That means they have more votes in the Electoral College, means they get more money in federal block grants. This is a big deal. And those 4 congressional seats, that's a bigger congressional delegation that illegals in China have, illegals in California have, than 13 other states in our union.
Yeah, it's twice as many congressional votes as Maine has, really, in the House of Representatives. And just to underscore your point, I don't think it would make a difference in the number of congressional seats Maine has, but we did get a copy of the instruction manual that census workers were given in Maine, and it was very clear that they are to count people, not citizens. They're to count all the persons in a household, and if they can't get an accurate count, they're allowed to guess or to take the head of household's word on how many people are in that household. So it's a very deliberate strategy that comes right from the federal government. They're instructed to count people, not actual citizens. So yeah, I mean, it's you can see very clearly how this works to enhance the power of the progressive left. And it seems like there's over the long term, the progressive side, the left side, with schemes like open border migration and a limitless welfare state, have engineered a long-term victory. President Trump wins office, or here in Maine, Governor LePage wins office, and there's these short-term victories where maybe there's some welfare reform, maybe there's some fiscal conservatism, or you have these small victories, but in a 10-year or a 20-year time frame, the left seems to be winning. So I guess what can we do to have a long-term strategy to counter that? Is there any long-term thinking that the U.S. should be engaged in order to confront what appears to be a more wise adversary in the form of communist China?
Yeah, I think it begins with an awareness. I went and briefed President Trump, Marco Rubio, Scott Bessent in the Oval Office about the book. I went to Capitol Hill and briefed half a dozen senators and senior members of Congress. They were surprised by a lot of it. So I think it begins with awareness, understanding this is not normal immigration. This is weaponized immigration. And until we deal with weaponized immigration, we can't have a good conversation about the level of legal immigration we want. I actually happen to like legal immigration. My parents migrated here from Europe and became citizens in 1977. But you can't calculate what is a good, healthy number for America if you're dealing with all this weaponized immigration. So it begins with awareness. The second thing we have to do is break the back, I think, of the political power. I think the deportations need to continue. The reason you're seeing so much resistance in places like Minnesota and California, hate to break it to people, it's not primarily about humanitarian concerns. It's about political power. If you have these deportations happening, California is going to lose a lot of political influence. So is Minneapolis. So is Illinois. They don't want that to happen. So they're doing it for raw political power. We need to look at changing how the census is conducted. We should be counting citizens, not people. We should be getting rid of birth tourism. And we should make sure that we continue to secure the border. Once you realize immigration is a weapon that has been deployed against us, that is their words, not mine, you begin to understand the context in which we can seek reform and change. And I think that's the beginning. And on that count, I have to say, Steve, at least I'm optimistic at this point. I feel like people are finally getting what's really going on in this space.
And the sad thing is, I know you're familiar with the book Unrestricted Warfare. In the 90s, the Chinese military just laid out exactly what their strategy was going to be. And over the next 25 years, it seems like very few people have actually paid attention to it, as they've implemented it over and over and over again to a very ruthless degree. So, Peter, thank you very much for joining us. You're personally, I think you're one of the best journalists in the country. Every time you come out with a book, it's jaw-dropping and deserves to be briefed right to the commander-in-chief and right to the Secretary of State. All of your work is of huge significance and just a material benefit to the well-being of the people of the United States. So we all owe you a benefit. And the latest book is The Invisible Coup. I encourage people to get it on Amazon, go listen to it if there's an audiobook. All of your work has been very fantastic, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you get into next. I know you're forward-looking and you're always planning. So any clues about what you guys might tackle next?
We're poking around a little bit, but I'm not prepared to say exactly what it is. And I just want to say you're doing amazing work in Maine. It's really terrific, and bravo. There's so little real investigative reporting that's going on anymore, but you were in the epicenter of it. So keep up the great work.
Well, thank you very much, Peter.